The world watched with growing concern as tensions between the United States and Canada, two of the world's closest allies, suddenly reached a boiling point. A new front had opened in the ongoing trade dispute. This time, not in distant boardrooms or over digital tariffs, but right along the world's longest undefended border, a line that has symbolized peace for generations. President Donald Trump, famous for his unpredictable and aggressive economic tactics, was visibly caught off guard by the strength and unity of Canada's response. British Columbia, a province that serves as a vital land bridge to Alaska, refused to be a passive participant in a trade war it didn't start. Instead, BC leaders took a bold stand, determined to protect their region's interests and send a clear message to Washington. For decades, American trucks have depended on BC's highways to keep Alaska supplied with everything from food to fuel. A route that's not just convenient, but absolutely essential for the people living in America's northernmost state. The mere threat of imposing tolls or restrictions on this corridor sent shockwaves from the halls of power in Washington, D.C. all the way to the remote capital of Juneau, Alaska, raising fears of shortages and economic disruption. Canada's move was more than just a symbolic gesture. It was a calculated strike at a unique American vulnerability, one that few had ever considered before. Alaska's economic stability, and even its basic daily life, depends on this overland passage through British Columbia. By leveraging this reality, BC showed it was willing to use every tool at its disposal. The dispute quickly escalated from distant policy debates to a high-stakes confrontation with real, immediate consequences for ordinary people. Families in Alaska worried about empty shelves, truckers facing delays, and communities on both sides of the border feeling the strain. Canada's actions revealed a new resolve, signaling to the world that it would defend its interests with strategic, targeted measures, even if it meant challenging its closest neighbor. As of June 25, 2025, both nations stand at a crossroads. The future of commerce, the stability of Alaska, and decades of friendly relations now hang in the balance as leaders on both sides weigh their next moves in this unprecedented standoff. The crisis began quietly, almost unnoticed at first, as tensions simmered beneath the surface between the United States and Canada. But soon, a series of aggressive moves from Washington would thrust the two countries into the spotlight, sending shockwaves through diplomatic and economic circles. President Trump announced steep tariffs on Canadian goods, threatening a 25% tax that would disrupt both economies and upend decades of cross-border cooperation. His rhetoric was pointed and uncompromising, demanding that Canada fall in line with U.S. interests or face severe consequences. The message was clear. America would no longer tolerate what it saw as unfair treatment. The proposed tariffs targeted key Canadian industries, steel, lumber, and agriculture, threatening thousands of jobs and the economic stability of entire communities. Trump's justification was simple. The U.S. was being treated unfairly in trade agreements like the USMCA, and he was determined to renegotiate the rules to favor American workers and businesses. He even made inflammatory comments about annexing Canada, fueling outrage north of the border and sparking protests in Canadian cities. The idea, though outlandish, stoked fears of American overreach. Though some tariffs were eventually paused or delayed, the damage was already done. Uncertainty and instability gripped businesses on both sides of the border, with small business owners and workers left wondering what the future would hold. Canadian leaders saw this as nothing less than economic warfare, not negotiation. The tone in Ottawa shifted from cautious optimism to open defiance. BC Premier David Eby declared that Trump had declared economic war on our country, a sentiment echoed by politicians and citizens nationwide, uniting Canadians in rare solidarity. The U.S. was now seen as weaponizing its economic power against its closest ally, turning a long-standing partnership into a battleground for leverage and control. The stage was set for unprecedented provincial retaliation, as Canada prepared to fight back in ways no one had anticipated. In response, British Columbia took a historic step. On March 17, 2025, Premier David Eby's government introduced the Economic Stabilization Tariff Response Act. The bill gave BC the authority to impose tolls on vehicles traveling to and from Alaska. This was no routine measure, it was a strategic weapon, leveraging BC's geography. The law allows the cabinet to set toll rates, target commercial trucks, and calibrate pressure on the U.S. Premier. EB framed it as self-defense. If the U.S. inflicts economic pain, we have a right to fight back. Deputy Premier Nikki Sharma added, "We will fight for BC's economy and workers with every tool we have." The move resonated with Canadians, turning a provincial issue into national pride. For the first time, a Canadian province prepared to directly tax American commerce as retaliation. The ball was now in Washington's court. The act didn't immediately put toll booths on the Alaska highway. No new fees are being collected, yet. The law is a contingency, a loaded weapon kept in reserve. BC officials made clear tolls would only be implemented if the U.S. escalates tariffs. The law's power lies in its potential, giving Canada a significant bargaining chip. Now, U.S. policymakers must weigh the risk of strangling Alaska's supply chain. The bill expires in May 2027, signaling it's a temporary crisis measure, not a permanent shift. BC hopes for normalcy, but is prepared for a prolonged standoff. The strategies show strength without firing the first shot. The government claims it's acting responsibly, preparing for the worst, hoping for the best. The pressure is now on President Trump. Are tariffs worth risking Alaska's lifeline? The stakes for both sides have never been higher. For Alaskans, the threat of tolls is existential. While most cargo arrives by sea, the overland route supplies critical, time-sensitive goods, especially fresh produce. Higher transportation costs would mean higher food prices for every Alaskan family. Alaska's oil, construction, and retail sectors all depend on this corridor. The Alaska Trucking Association warns tolls could cripple the state's fragile supply chain. Alaska's unique dependence on Canadian goodwill is now a vulnerability. Alaskans are caught in a trade war they didn't start, facing real threats to their daily lives. The prospect of tolls turns a political dispute into a kitchen table crisis. BC's stance was part of a broader Canadian response. Prime Minister Trudeau's government announced retaliatory tariffs, creating a national strategy. Ontario imposed a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the U.S., targeting cross-border energy trade. Yukon halted liquor purchases from U.S. companies and restricted American access to government contracts. Leaders across Canada echoed BC's defiance, framing the dispute as a matter of sovereignty. Premier Eby declared, "Canadians are standing tall." Yukon's Premier Pillai added, "We must stand up for our country and way of life." Even Alaska's Governor Dunleavy urged restraint, highlighting Alaskans' difficult position. The unified Canadian response sent a clear message. The whole country was prepared to stand its ground. The conflict had become a continental standoff. Alaska wasn't powerless. It had leverage of its own. State leaders targeted BC's lucrative tourism industry, threatening to bypass Canadian ports. Senator Dan Sullivan proposed waiving the Passenger Vessel Services Act, PVSA, which requires cruise ships to stop in Canada en route to Alaska. A waiver would let ships sail directly from Washington to Alaska, bypassing BC entirely. The U.S. had done this before, during the COVID-19 pandemic. Losing cruise traffic would devastate BC's tourism economy, which relies on millions of passengers each summer. Thousands of jobs and hundreds of businesses would be at risk. The threat created a scenario of mutually assured economic destruction. If BC squeezes Alaska's supply chain, Alaska can squeeze BC's tourism. The stakes and the risks rose dramatically for both sides. Behind the politics, real people's lives hang in the balance. In Alaska, tolls could mean higher grocery bills and delayed construction projects. Truck drivers face threats to their livelihoods, forced to absorb costs or pass them on. In BC, tourism workers could lose entire seasons of income if cruise ships stop coming. Restaurant owners, tour guides, and hotel staff all face uncertainty. The economic ties between Alaska and BC have created mutual dependence. The conflict threatens to unravel that fabric, turning neighbors into adversaries. The true cost is measured in disrupted lives and lost livelihoods. As of June 25, 2025, the standoff between the United States and Canada remains tense and unresolved, with both sides watching each other's next move closely. The border, once a symbol of cooperation, now feels like a fault line, with uncertainty hanging in the air for businesses, travelers, and entire communities on both sides. British Columbia's controversial toll law is officially on the books, but it hasn't been activated yet. Meanwhile, the U.S. continues to threaten tariffs, and Alaska's cruise industry is anxiously eyeing alternative routes. The stakes are high, and the economic ripple effects are already being felt in border towns and port cities. The next decisions made in Washington, Ottawa, and Victoria will shape not just the immediate future, but potentially the long-term relationship between the two countries. Political leaders are under pressure from local industries, workers, and voters to find a solution. There is still hope for de-escalation. Diplomacy could pave the way for a mutual stand-down, with both sides stepping back from the brink. Behind closed doors, negotiators are working overtime to find common ground and avoid a damaging trade war. The Trump administration could choose to withdraw its tariff threats, which might prompt British Columbia to shelve its toll plans and restore a sense of normalcy. Such a move would be welcomed by businesses and families who depend on cross-border trade. But if the U.S. moves forward with tariffs, British Columbia is prepared to retaliate. Alaska, feeling squeezed, will push even harder to bypass Canadian ports. The result could be a full-blown economic crisis, with job losses, higher prices, and mounting frustration on both sides of the border. The region faces a lose-lose scenario if leaders refuse to compromise. Everyday people, truck drivers, shop owners, and families stand to lose the most if the standoff drags on. This conflict is a stark reminder of just how interconnected the two nations are. Decades of cooperation have built a web of economic and social ties that are now at risk. The fate of grocery prices in Alaska is now tied to a tour guide's job in Victoria, and the livelihoods of thousands depend on what happens next. Every decision ripples across borders, affecting lives in unexpected ways. The coming weeks will test whether this long-standing friendship can survive a new era of economic conflict, or if it will be reshaped by the pressures of politics and protectionism.